Welcome to this BGSM podcast. My name is Stefan Griffin. I'm a member of the BGSM editorial team and the junior doctor working in central London. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Markus Walden. Markus is a Swedish-based orthopedic surgeon and sports medicine doctor. He's a world-renowned researcher and part of the football research group in Sweden with the likes of Martin Haglund and Jan Ekstrand. He completed his PhD on the epidemiology of injuries in elite football, and he talks on the topic internationally. He will be speaking at the annual Arsenal Sport and Exercise Medicine Conference in London on March the 19th. And Markus, welcome to the podcast. In your role with the football research group, as we mentioned, what is the current injury landscape in professional football?
Yes, I think we first of all need to acknowledge that a male professional football player has a very high injury risk, and it has been shown from previous studies in the UK that this risk is about 1,000 times higher than other high-risk occupations such as construction and mining. But fortunately, most injuries are not severe. We usually define severe injuries as being absent from football for 4 weeks or more, and that's only between 10 and 15% of them. So most of the injuries are actually not severe, but there are very many of them. Nowadays we see a lot of muscle injuries, and that didn't used to be like that. We saw many sprains before in the 1980s and 1990s, but now muscle injuries constitute more than 1/3 of injuries, of all time loss injuries in professional football. And the single injury subtype standing out is, of course, the hamstring injury.
Absolutely, and I guess your PhD would have been based on that topic. And I imagine it's coming up to sort of 10, 15 years that you've been involved with the football research group now. How have you seen things change, or have you seen things change at all over the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, we started the studies in 2001, so it's quite many years now, and we have quite a big data set. So lately we have been able to carry out time trend analysis, and we have seen that, as I said before briefly, there are fewer sprains nowadays and more strains. So there has been a little bit of a shift of injury panorama, but basically the injury risk is stable. No big changes over the time, but a slightly different injury pattern.
Okay, and in terms of how that's changed over the last few years, I guess hand in hand with the change that you've described, there's been sort of quite big advances in football medicine. I know it's been touched on in blogs, in editorials, and in papers. Why, with such advanced sports science, are we not seeing a decrease in injuries?
Yeah, maybe we can turn and say that we might have expected an ongoing increase in injuries, so that we actually have a stable injury incidence means that we can actually prevent a few injuries, because we know the intensity of the game is increasing, and the style of the game has changed since the 1980s and 1990s as well. So maybe it's not that pessimistic as you might think from a brief look at it.
Okay, brilliant. And you've touched upon muscle injuries. I know you're also, as an orthopedic surgeon, you're especially interested in the knee and ACL injuries. I've seen some great data coming out from the football research group about trends in ACL injuries across Europe. How has this changed over the last few years? And are there regional differences in the incidence and then potentially the management of ACL injuries?
ACL injury is actually a quite difficult injury to study, because it's very attention drawing, but actually it's not very common. We usually say that it's one ACL injury every second season for a professional club. So you really need to have a big sample to do proper studies. But we have looked a little bit into regional differences in Europe, and we have seen that the Mediterranean countries, they actually have a much higher rate of non-contact ACL injuries compared to countries with a more harsh climate, or what you say. So we think there is something with the shoe surface traction differences between the different regions in Europe. We have also looked at the time trends here, of course, and we have seen a small increase in the absolute number, but it's not statistically significant. But we see, on the other hand, a decline, sometimes also a significant decline for many of the other sprains, such as MCL sprains of the knee and ankle sprains. But for ACL injuries, there is a slight increase actually, but non-significant.
Okay, and I guess coming to the shoe surface traction, you guys will be informing the ongoing work with trying to look at plastic pitches or artificial pitches. Have you guys done much research from that point of view when it comes to ligament or soft tissue injuries at all?
At the moment, we are not doing any turf studies at all, but we used to do it when they introduced the turfs, the artificial turfs in Europe, and we saw no difference between natural grass and artificial turf from a general point of view. But there were too few injuries to look at the uncommon specific injury times, such as the ACL injury.
Okay, and as you mentioned a few minutes ago now, I was probably painting quite a pessimistic view of how injuries haven't decreased with whilst the intensity has increased. What do you think that's potentially down to a certain advance in the field? Is there anything you can put this down to, or do you think it's just good practice being adopted slightly wider afield?
Yeah, I think we have seen really a shift in the past decade. If we start on the research side, there are so many studies now from the world of football. In the 1980s and 1990s, they were scarce, and there were very few RCTs. But now we don't know. We don't just have many studies, we also have many good studies, we have many RCTs, and I think really evidence-based medicine is practiced more on the field nowadays than it used to be. So actually I wouldn't be too surprised if we 2, 3, 4 or 5 years down the road actually see a decrease in the injuries.
Brilliant. I guess we look forward to seeing that, and I guess it'd be a big relief to yourselves and UEFA as well.
Yeah.
Over the last 10-15 years, or since 2001, as you mentioned, I mean the scale of the projects that you guys have been carrying out. What have been the big challenges to yourselves as an organisation from that point of view?
Yeah, you know, the football research group, it started in Sweden under the leadership of Jan Ekstrand, as you mentioned, and Martin Hägglund has also been a key person. So we started very small in Linköping, and then we grew to the rest of Sweden and to Scandinavia. But nowadays we are really an international group, and we also have members from the UK, such as Alan McCall from Arsenal and Mike Davison in the group. And I think one challenge is to continue keep the group together, and we also need to work hard on a daily basis.
The challenges for the UCL, the UEFA Elites Players project that you've been involved in for a number of years, can you sort of give us an insight into how that's progressed over the last few years, the challenges and how you've overcome these?
I also think that the big challenge is to meet up with the new technology that has been introduced, such as GPS data and so on, and we really need to do something with all these data from an injury perspective as well, and that's also a challenge for the future.
Fab. And for organisations around the world who will look at the UCL study and see it as the sort of a gold standard and one of the leading projects around, what tips would you give for those people looking to carry out such large-scale projects? And I know you work across a very multidisciplinary team. What are your sort of top tips for these people?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you need to know that this is no single man's or woman's work. You really need to be a team with different skills and competencies, and I also think that you need to have the governing bodies on board, domestically or internationally, and I must give credit here to UEFA, who has supported us during all years and been very professional with the work of our study. And I know there has been some efforts, for example, in handball. I work with handball as well, but that's more difficult because the governing bodies, they are not so diverse, the governing bodies in football and so on. So there are a bigger threshold to pass before initiating similar studies in other sports.
Okay, brilliant. That'd be really useful for listeners who are trying to get involved with big, large-scale research projects. And I know you're talking at the Arsenal conference on March the 19th, I think it is, about sort of avoiding early recurrence after injury. I guess you're in the position where you're at the forefront of research in this field, but also, like you said, you're working within clinical sport and exercise medicine. What can people expect to hear from you on the topic, and what are your sort of your key messages, your top tips about the importance, and then obviously the practical side of avoiding early reoccurrence?
Just to give a short teaser here, we know that re-injuries are actually not very common. It's less than 10% of all injuries occurring within 2 months after return to play. But on the other hand, the two injuries having the highest injury burden in football, that is hamstring injury and ACL injury, they are associated with a few early re-injuries. And I will give you some scenarios and examples of how to manage and avoid early re-injuries after these two injuries. For example, would it be justifiable to delay return to play plus 1 week for all hamstring injuries? And would it be justifiable to delay the return with plus 1 month after an ACL injury, etc.?
Brilliant. And I really look forward to hearing it. And I know from a BJSM point of view, we'll be there to live tweet a lot of the talks, and we'll be able to take questions from anyone who can't be there. But thank you very much for your time, Markus, and for the teaser. I know I'd love to go into it in a lot more detail, but I think people will have to get to the Emirates to come and hear the rest of it. But thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan.
No problem at all.
My pleasure.
So for listeners, you can find details of the conference by following the Arsenal Sports Medicine team on Twitter. They're at Arsenal SEMS. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you there. And if you have any questions for Markus, I'm sure he'll be open to answering them on social media. And just keep on following the BGSM for live updates from the conference itself. Thank you very much.